Oh, which one of these am I going to do first? Let's do this. Okay. What?
Down, yeah.
Okay. So, I apologize to the camera person who's going to have to watch me pace back and forth. This mini grant was part of a larger effort to find more or less the pulse of what's going on in assessment outside of the Middle States accrediting body. And why? Well, because one of the things that Middle States wants to push on everybody for assessment is that you need this outside evaluation. You need to know what everybody else is doing, and if they also feel that what you're doing is good and you feel what they're doing is good. And so I thought, well, how better to really figure this out than to look at other accrediting bodies and see what their pulse is and figure out where Middle States is in that grander scheme of things, and maybe what we can learn from looking at them and what they can learn from looking at us. And so that kind of motivated me to look at another accrediting body called SACS. And the reason, one of the reasons that I chose this accreditation body is because SACS is what covers, it's called the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. It is what covers the southern portion of the United States that I'm from. And I remember as a child, my mother was head of an education department at Mississippi College for a time, and they had to go through CACREP accreditation and SACS accreditation. I remember all through my childhood, she'd just hear her say every now and then out of nowhere, SACS! And sort of the going idea with SACS and what you hear if you go to these conferences, especially with other accreditation bodies, is that SACS is arguably the worst, a lot more strict and strenuous. Ironically, what is kind of strange about going to a SACS conference is that it's Southern people. And so you go to a Middle States conference and everybody dresses at least like this or with a tie or something like this. You go to a SACS conference that's allegedly a lot more strenuous, and they're in shorts and a t-shirt. And one of the presenters was in a sleeveless t-shirt through the whole thing, the president of a college. This is true. And so I felt very out of place because I literally wore this outfit and everybody else is in shorts and a t-shirt. But at any rate, SACS is the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. And again, it is much more strenuous, but its main focus, just like Middle States and just like every other accrediting body that I'm aware of, is assessment. And for SACS, the theme of their SARE conference was, we talk about assessment, but we really don't do it, or we don't really do it. And what I found to be interesting about this is exactly the kind of commentary that we've been having on this campus, and it's exactly the kind of commentary that you hear at Middle States conferences in Philadelphia or DC. So what I wanted to do for this little brief period was kind of highlight some of the things that I was able to draw from all of the different presentations that I attended, and sort of with an eye to what can I bring that's new and what can I refresh that's old to our assessment committee and to our college as a whole. And so the highlights of this conference were basically to describe the key elements of assessment, to list the essential elements, to assess the quality of outcomes, to describe components of an effective assessment management process, and to clearly articulate organizational components and support related to successfully implementation of program assessment. Now, what I'm going to talk about is going to be hitting these high points, but really particularly with an eye towards program assessment. We've just been through kind of the hurdle, especially we faculty have been through the hurdle of assessing our courses, and now there's more of a push to look at programs. I know the education program is coming up for review. Student services is coming up for review, which I've got a little hand in at the moment. So I found this conference particularly insightful for informing those kinds of processes. So what I will focus on for the most part in this talk will be how this affects really program assessment, and then kind of a little bit of commentary on where SACS sort of is different from what Middle States expects, and is there sort of a common ground to be had between the two. All of this you've heard before from our Associate Dean. We're still pulling the information out of our throats because it's been shoved there. Assessment is something required for accreditation. Assessment is what faculty do in the classroom. Assessment is used for continuous improvement. Assessment is used to evaluate performance, and we talk about assessment, but we don't really do it. Now, unlike what they say about us talking about assessment but not really doing it. Our spin was, we do it all the time, we just don't put it in writing. Both of those kind of deserve a little attention. For the opening presentation of the SACS conference, as by the way is in Orlando, Florida, which I can honestly say is one of the creepiest places I've ever been on earth. They wanted to start with a definition of what assessment was. And they came up with this idea kind of in a roundtable discussion that assessment is the examination and review of evidence representing levels of performance, accomplishment, and knowledge. And then they began to discuss, well, what do you do with assessment? And this was a part that I thought was particularly interesting. If you've been exposed to the newsletters that I and my committee have been putting out over the past couple of semesters, you've seen this commentary before. It's drawing a distinction between formative and summative assessment. Now, both for SACS and for Middle States, these are both worthwhile ventures in assessment. It's not just about numerically assessing the quality of some kind of instruction, but it is also learning from the process of engaging in assessment. And I think it is therein that we can sort of separate the idea of, well, this is bad statistics, these are bad data, la 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 la. I think that there is something to be gained from simply engaging in the process and looking at your course material, unpacking it, and then assessing it can teach you just as much as looking at the data itself. One of these, providing feedback to support improvement, is that sort of formative, not graded kind of understanding of what assessment is, whereas summative assessment is looking at the evaluated data sort of driven part. For SACS, there are 4 different levels of assessment instead of just 3. We sort of go from course to program to institution, or from body like student services to institution. There, they demand classroom assessment and then course assessment, which is a little bit tickier. They actually encourage their colleges to rope into their teacher evaluations a classroom assessment to be used in assessing the whole course. So it really is a sort of a roots-forward approach that every class is evaluated that has to do with a particular course, and then that course is fed into the program, which is then fed into the institution. Trying to move quickly. Another big highlight of this conference was establishing linkages, and particularly how they are related to budget. Now, I found this particularly interesting because this is a way, and a pretty nice and easy to get your head around way, for any faculty member, any department, or any program, or any services to advocate for more money. That everything that SACS was talking about in terms of assessment was related to, you are not just making a case to improve your course or your classroom or your program or your institution, you are making a case, a data-driven case, that suggests, hey, we need more money for this, or we don't need more money for this. And I think focusing our attentions in this way with an eye towards not just linking up from the classroom to the course to the program to the institution, but linking all of that to strategic planning and budget is something that should be a little bit more transparent and definitely necessary in our assessment process. It's something that we can certainly implement in our departments. Whereas academic program assessment typically focuses on student outcomes or student learning outcomes, there is another kind of assessment of administrative units. And this is more related to developmental outcomes that assess products, processes, and services. And so really when we're assessing a program or a unit, it makes more sense to not just focus on the student end of that, but also on the products and services end of that. In the work that I'm doing, at least starting to do with Jane and Diane, we are focusing on not just linking our outcomes to the student services outcomes and then linking those to the college mission statement. We're also forming outcomes that are not just student-driven, but also unit-driven. So we can assess our services and we can assess how the students are responding to those services. So we have two student learning outcomes that are going to be generated largely from Key 195, and then we have three other kinds of outcomes that are going to be generated to assess the quality of the products and services that the Learning Center offers. When I said developmental outcome, I screwed up. I meant operational outcome. It's the operational outcomes that allow us to assess the products and services, whereas the student learning outcomes allow us to assess how the students are responding to those products. And these are really two different kinds of ideas. Whereas in the course, it may not make as much sense to assess those kinds of operational outcomes. For a unit, it certainly does. Most units and most things like student services are service-driven. So it makes sense to have outcomes that are attached to both of these ideas. Now, that's not to say that they couldn't be implemented in terms of a course evaluation or a program evaluation. I know that our departments always meet and our programs always meet, and I know that Jim and I and Ann meet and talk about the usefulness of our textbooks and what textbooks we're going to use next and all of this. Why wouldn't this be useful in determining how we write our assessment report? Isn't it part of summative and formative, particularly formative assessment, to inform our accreditation bodies that we are meeting and evaluating the usefulness of our sources? Surely we do it all the time. Why are we not writing? I like acronyms. Very short one that I'm not going to go over too much, but just allow you to sit and read it, is to be smart about defining your outcomes, whether they are operational or student learning driven. They should be specific, measurable, aggressive, but still attainable, results oriented, and those that can work within a particular time frame. I can give you more time to read this, but I see in the interest of time I'm kind of running short and I've still got another one of these to do. When assessing student learning and programs, this was another thing that I highlighted in one of the newsletters that I wrote. There's such a thing as direct and indirect measures. And just like Middle States, SACS is more concerned with formative, process-driven assessment, more so than product-driven assessment. So we can look at direct measures, are you getting the grade, and indirect measures, do you feel like you're learning something? We can look at direct measures, are students using the student services? Or indirect measures, do you feel like the student services are available at your disposal?
So Nick, one thing like about the classroom, are you saying that these folks put an emphasis on how students experience the classroom environment?
Yes.
Qualitatively,
yes.
Rather than, okay, they did this on this quiz, they did this on this test, and they make that a part of their formal assessment process, is the qualitative aspect of learning?
Yes, as being one part. So that sort of approaches that formative sort of process-driven, getting you to think about what you're learning and assessing whether or not you feel like you're learning is kind of a different animal than just getting an A on a test. I mean, when we think about methodological design, there's a million, and I tell my students this, there's a million different ways to make 100 on a test. So just looking at the numbers is not enough. There's got to be some qualitative inference in there, and that indirect piece of measuring how you feel the availability of information is, or how you feel you're learning, is arguably just important and can certainly easily be used in a commentary write-up or a monitoring report. Yes?
The reverse is